you read every day about fraud in healthcare. There's a lot of stuff out there in the newspaper. Can you kind of maybe start, just kind of give us a sense of sort of the big areas of fraud that you see out there?
Sure. Being a specialist in lying, cheating, and stealing has really taken one to appreciate the ethically challenged. And when you look at healthcare fraud, I need to divide it into a couple of buckets. The first one is individually identifiable information. So basically your PII, identity theft. Healthcare is a rich environment to steal people's identity. That's really the first threat. The second threat has to do with products, pharmaceuticals, drug diversion, and so forth. So really we are all vulnerable to this area.
So you mentioned personally identifiable information, which kind of makes me start thinking about all the data that's out there, right? With a lot of the activity that's been going on in healthcare lately, we're seeing data being transferred from healthcare companies to insurers to the government, et cetera. I mean, what are you seeing out there in terms of risk related to that?
Well, you'll hear the term big data a lot, and it is true. The amount of data that we create in the last 2 years is equivalent to what has been created since the beginning of time. And what's happening that's unique to healthcare is that there's a push for electronic healthcare systems. And while we're going through this growing phase, we're actually very vulnerable. So we're prone to cyber attacks or people trying to break into systems. And so that's really our key vulnerability is we're going through a lot of growth, but during that time period, we're also vulnerable to people who are trying to get at our information.
It's kind of a balancing act, right? Because where on one side we want to be more efficient and effective in how we're doing things, so we're developing these great systems, but then those systems are exposing us maybe to potential new types of potential fraud with all the data that's going out there. What do you think are some of the top risks from an auditor's perspective that we should be thinking about?
Well, that's a great question. And again, twofold. While all the healthcare professionals are working on developing and including new technologies and so forth, focusing on their core competency, they really need to have a parallel team that's focusing on the security, the risks, and approaches to it. So don't forget, because I'm often asked about PII among healthcare providers and so forth, really it's all employers. Because your human capital, your people, those are your assets. So when an employer, so this is really independent of industry or type of company that you have, if you don't have doing a PII audit of your staff, all right, within your company, how it transfers back and forth identities in a beneficiary file, in addition to those who actually are healthcare entities, your clients and your customers, it's really important that you are actually monitoring those exchanges, how it's going from point A to point B.
So you've been working on a model, or you work with a model to help you to identify fraud and work through that. Maybe can you tell us a little bit more about the model that you're using?
Sure. It's a painful model from mistakes. Those are always the best lessons learned. And when you think about big data, people get very overwhelmed. In fact, you probably would have to have 1,000 MySQL writers to sit there and write enough algorithms and tests to stay on top of it. And what they're doing is they're taking the approach from abnormal. They're looking for abnormal patterns. I'm actually going in the opposite direction. So my behavioral pattern is actually focused on what's normal, because it's easier to get at that, because what can you assume? If you outline what's normal, what's everything else?
Abnormal.
Thank you,
yeah.
Abnormal. So it allows you to work through the noise, filter out. So there's 6 behaviors that I've been using now for 7 years. I teach it in classes to identify and get at what is normal, and it allows an auditor or an investigator to actually sift through and figure out where are really my vulnerabilities in that.
I think that's a really interesting approach, because so often auditors are looking for what's wrong, and
Right.
you're almost kind of saying, well, look for what's right, and that will help lead you
Right.
to what's wrong. Is that how you would describe it?
Well, absolutely, and it actually stems back from an approach I learned in nursing school teaching a class. The reason why is because in order to look at abnormal, you're making an assumption on what the problem is. And people who are ethically challenged or people who are creative, because it takes a lot of creativity to lie, cheat, and steal, you have to manipulate someone. Well, they're changing their patterns every 6 to 12 months. So there's a study that was put out by ACFE that it takes 18 months in order for a fraud to materialize in an employment setting. Well, think about it. If you're really skilled, you just change your pattern every 6 months, and it's always something new. So the best way to have like an open mind or not create tunnel vision is to focus on outlining, pulling out what's normal, and then seeing what's left behind.